really important concept with conservation outside of protected areas is working with local people. Traditional people often have ways of living that are sustainable, and other terms that might be preferred by the people themselves might be native or tribal or indigenous. So you do need to be careful to make sure you're using the preferred term of the people that you're working with. In Mexico and India, areas occupied by traditional people often have higher conservation value and more intact forest. So these native peoples are preserving biodiversity at a higher rate. There are about 400 million traditional people living in over 70 countries and occupying about 20% of the world's land. It's often good to empower those people to obtain the legal title of the land and allow them to management. And that does mean relinquishing control and letting them make decisions that are best for them. But a lot of times when they do that, their cultural values often are consistent with conserving biodiversity in that area, often because they have important cultural values for the biodiversity. Some areas, there are large amounts of land owned by traditional people. In Papua New Guinea, it's 97% of the land. In Amazon, it's about 22%. A fifth of Canada is owned by the Inuit, and there's about 90 million hectares owned by Indigenous peoples in Australia. Management can often benefit from traditional ecological knowledge. So these traditional peoples have been living in these ecosystems for a really long time. And a lot of what is passed down from generation to generation are practices that have actually benefited biodiversity in that area. When we try to impose new technological ways of doing things, or things that maybe Europeans learn to do in Europe, it doesn't always work as well in other native ecosystems. So using the traditional ecological knowledge and empowering local people to use it themselves often is beneficial for biodiversity. Ownership by traditional people tries to avoid something called eco-colonialism. And this is basically a disregard for traditional rights and thinking that Europeans or people in charge know better how to manage for biodiversity and disempower traditional peoples to set up new protected areas. This is a really important social justice issue, and there is a really important intersection between conservation and social justice. And so considering this, traditional people are often extremely important stakeholders, and having them help make decisions or make decisions all on their own is an important thing to recognize. It is also important to note that traditional ownership is not a guarantee for conservation, but it is better for social justice issues. So sometimes we need to think about that and decide how best to move forward. But having a voice at the table is better than taking control away from traditional ownership. Here are some examples. In Brazil, land owned by indigenous people is very, very important, and there's a lot of biodiversity conserved by indigenous people. And as I said, many times there is important knowledge that these indigenous tribes have that is better for managing these forests than using things we learned from other areas. So all of the purple is land owned by indigenous people. Green are strictly protected areas, and the kind of gray color are places that are being deforested the fastest. And so you can see that there's actually a lot more land owned by indigenous peoples than there is strictly protected. And so they have an important role in preventing deforestation in the Amazon. Another type of multi-use area is called extractive reserves, and these are where they allow for local product harvest. And local product harvest is very important for a lot of local people. Many protected areas do not allow local product harvest, and it can become a tragedy of the commons if it's not managed well. And so they have to have strict rules about how to do this in a sustainable way for it to also conserve biodiversity. Extractive reserves try to solve these problems. They're used in Brazil with about 3 million hectares, and it allows for the harvest of medicine seeds, rubber, resins, and Brazil nuts. And this is an example of a man collecting the latex from a tree from a rubber tree. And so rubber is a latex produced by a tree. It's an exudate. So when you cut into the bark, it flows out, and you can collect it to make natural rubber. These extractive reserves help local people and guards against large-scale land conversion. So it gives the people an economic incentive to preserve the land because they're getting some economic benefit from it, but it preserves a lot of it by maintaining the actual forest there. Another way of thinking about this is through payments of ecosystem services. And the idea is that you pay people for maintaining forests or restoring ecosystems that provide important ecosystem services. There are international markets that rural people can use. And the idea is that if we want to support carbon sequestration to prevent climate change, we can pay someone to keep their forest there to help with climate change. Or for other things, there might be a city nearby and we want to pay somebody to keep wetlands to help buffer the city from flooding, things like that. An example of this is a program called RED, which is part of the climate negotiations. It stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, and basically carbon credits funded for protecting forests and maintaining wildlife. The idea is that people in the developed world will pay people in tropical areas to protect the forest as a way to reduce emissions and prevent climate change. Sometimes they pay enough to support a community, but sometimes the incentive isn't large enough, and so it doesn't actually work. The core idea of RED is to have places buy these credits. They filter down to local governments and land users through a chain, and the idea is to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases overall. I do want to point out that there are some indigenous peoples that are very much against RED. They don't want to rent out their forests, and they're worried that this will cause land grabbing and corruption and conflict, and that the indigenous peoples risk displacement and violence. So there is some arguments and some controversies surrounding these ideas and their implementation. I think the overall ideas might work, but looking at exactly how they're implemented and having a voice of the local people that might be affected by these is going to be really important. Finally, I wanted to give you a case study. Your book talks about this. This is from Namibia, which is a country on the southwestern part of Africa. Here, I have a map. So it's just north of South Africa on the west coast of Africa. And they've implemented something that involves community-based natural resource management, and it's been extremely effective. Basically, the government granted traditional communal groups the right to use and manage wildlife. These communal groups needed to form a management committee and to delineate their exact boundaries. The idea is that they can get income from tour operators to pay guards and to pay for monitoring wildlife species. And then they can apply for a trophy hunting quota, which is granted if the wildlife populations are large enough. And then they can charge large amounts to people that want to trophy hunt. And then they also get to eat the meat that are the benefit, because a lot of times trophy hunters just want the skin or the head, and that leaves a lot of meat that could benefit local communities. And this picture shows some of the landscape that we're talking about. Once they have a management plan, they can enact subsistence hunting for these 4 species. You can see the gemsbok, the kudu, the springbok, and the warthogs. And there's been 79 of these conservancies established, covering almost 20% of Namibia since the program started in 1996. And it seems to be successful. It's empowering local people, and it's giving them an important voice, and it's giving them an incentive to conserve wildlife in their own area. And so it seems to be a really good example of how local people can be important in conserving things and conserving wildlife. And Namibia has the largest populations of cheetahs and black rhino in Africa. And so they think this is really important evidence to show that this is a good model for conservation. These conservancies also have higher abundances and diversity than adjacent areas. So giving local people a stake in conservation and an incentive for conservation can be very helpful, especially where biodiversity is high and needs to be conserved. This shows the distribution of current and emerging community conservancies in Namibia, in which these communal groups agreed to protect biodiversity. So these red outlines are the community conservancies. The dark green are other conservancies. The blue are protected areas, which you can see there are a few, and it shows the different biomes. So you can see that a lot of these community conservancies are in tree and shrub savanna, as well as in this semi-desert kind of area, where the protected areas, a lot of them are in the desert, which is not places where as many people live.